Um, but yeah, so just to repeat, the prompt or provocation, we are all talking about the regenerative economy, but until we're actually doing / talking about doing the sector shifting work that requires bringing stakeholders together to radically, intentionally shift sectors, and that is the really hard work. No one is really doing regenerative economy until we start doing that. So that's the pattern that I'm seeing right now, in terms of, especially the both of you, starting to try to find angles, ways into doing that sector shifting work, but also coming up against a lot of people who not only don't understand it, but also totally ready to start criticizing it. While again talking about this idealized regenerative economy that we'll suddenly magically have in 50 years' time. So maybe, Lorraine, you'd like to start opening that up for us.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for bringing us together. It's such a big topic. I have more questions than answers, but I guess I'll just add to the provocation that I do see a lot of action happening. And so I'm mostly working with large corporates, mostly in a North American or Northern setting, but I also work with one pretty big industrial player based in the South, in Brazil. And I'd say, you know, my anecdotal population sample describes a lot of celebration of action, things that are happening. And I would say they're pretty ambitious actions, but they still sit within the sustainability realm. So we're celebrating things that are, and I'm going to sound critical, I am criticizing, we're celebrating progress towards the SDGs. We're celebrating the issuance of new green bonds. We're celebrating steps that fit very squarely into a seemingly ambitious sustainability agenda. And we're not recognizing the gap that is between that and being truly regenerative, as you describe. I do hear off the record, I hear dialogue about that in some of the more sort of sparky camps within these companies. I do hear a recognition of this, but that's, I think they're asking the same questions like, yeah, how do we mobilize and how do we really make change? So I'm sitting with the question, I've got some ideas, but I'm curious, Garry, what you think. You're actually on the inside of industry.
Thanks for that baton, Lorraine, and thanks, Sam, for the invitation. It's so interesting listening to you actually explain, Lorraine, a bit more deeply what you're sensing, because for me, this is super new. So I've done a lot of the inner work that so many of us talk about, in terms of like the awareness piece and how do I fit in and who am I, you know, all like the quite grand sort of spiritual realization. And then I'm now sitting in this space of, that's lovely. I'm now more aware. And so what? And like the so what for me is like, I'm working in a 3.5 billion turnover global chemical distributor. I'm speaking, and I have to do that as a public traded company. I'm speaking as Garry and not on their behalf. Important to note. Hopefully we won't have to do that in 10 years' time. But for now we do. And I think what's really interesting is I've started, as Sam and you now know, Lorraine, this sort of outreach really to try and better understand, like you with questions, like what do people feel, what does it feel like to work within the chemical and allied industries? When I say allied, I mean up and downstream, so upstream, big oil, energy, chemical intermediate manufacture, then through to, you know, manufacturing products, and then you of course have consumer. But the big part of this as well, which I think we forget, is the global supply chain that wraps all of that. So I still think that I know we still, within the chemical industry and up and downstream, we still view every part of that chain as very separate. They are not communicated or discussed as connected in any way, shape or form. So even from a point of view of an organizational setting, you know, my own organization has sales, has marketing, has finance, and they barely talk to each other within an organizational setting meaningfully. And I mean that, I have to emphasize that point. Meaningfully is like this, like, okay, oh, how do we connect one another? How do we serve one another? What are the problems? How do we work through those together? So I think my summary message is, being on the inside of big industry, it's still heavily symptomatic and not root cause looking, and still heavily disconnected and not joined up. That would probably be the two my two experiences, and actually as I reach out to more people in the industry, I had a chat with someone today actually who works at a food manufacturer in the UK, who works in comms, and he had exactly the same sensing. I spoke with a global leader of sustainability in the US, 3,500 people 3 weeks ago, exactly the same sensing, really reinforcing, Lorraine, your point that there is a lot of good, well-meaning intention, but it seems to be quite disparate and not as joined up as maybe it otherwise could be.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Samantha, I don't know if you want to go. I there's something I'm itching to say, but
Go for it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So if I think about what it actually looks like to go, like Samantha, from your call out from talking about this to actually doing it. And then Garry, you're describing the lack of joined upness across these really vast and complex supply chains. I imagine what it looks like, and then I recognize why it's not happening. So let me spell it out a little bit. I'll pick on my global forest products friends in Brazil. No need to name names, although this will be pretty consistent across the board. So they are one of the largest landholders in Brazil with a couple million hectares of land under management. And that is plantation forest, which is how most paper products make it into the marketplace these days. So they plant eucalyptus trees. About every 7 years, they're ready for harvest. They get pulped, baled, and then off to the manufacturers, who might be like the Kimberly-Clarks of the world, to turn into household tissue, toilet paper, napkins, diapers, hygiene products, feminine hygiene products, etc. So that's like, I'm certainly guilty of using toilet paper. I don't want to make assumptions about you all, but for sure, I'm using household paper products every day. So it's in my sphere. And so we can say that we know plantations are a problem. In fact, there's really interesting literature that would say that the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was not the steam engine, it was the plantation economy. And that was based on, of course, slave labor. So it wasn't a technological innovation, it was a sociological and socioeconomic, I hate to use the word innovation, but let's say change, that used free labor and extractive methods to change the way things were grown. So now we have a plantation, we have the eucalyptus plantation. We can say, well, that's definitely not regenerative. It can be done more sustainably, and they are, of course, doing it more sustainably, but it's not regenerative. It's not how nature would be doing things left to her own talents. So what does it look like to change that? Well, okay, there's all this land, and then there's people, and they're, of course, trying to do the right thing according to the SDGs and all sorts of amazing stakeholder engagement to work with local indigenous, quilombola, and other marginalized communities in Brazil. No, but what does it really look like for 2.2 million hectares of land to be as biodiverse and healthy as possible? Okay, well, we could actually have that conversation, and they're having it. Like, yeah, let's make this forest as rich and diverse as possible. But then we three, do we still use toilet paper? Or do we innovate our ways out of toilet paper and all the household paper products that are based on a pretty consistent production of a kind of pulp? We could, like, I can imagine a world without toilet paper. There was a world not that long ago that didn't have toilet paper, and we all managed, and we looked at waste differently, and. And then if you go even further downstream, quite literally, into how sewage is managed, you realize that that product ultimately ends up in sewage treatment. And there's all kinds of ways of looking at sewage treatment as actually water resource recovery. And there's just oodles of ways to see it. But there's so much involved, from rehabilitating land to engaging communities, kind of giving back, undoing the damage of slave labor, recognizing what that pulp is as it makes its way through this value web, our own household habits and ways of functioning, and how we, right down to things like how we toilet train children, like transitioning from diapers to toilet paper. There is so much involved in this that when I talk to my peers within this company, who is a client, I think, where does their responsibility begin and end? And we're just beginning to really explore those questions and conversations. So I think that's part of why it isn't exactly happening, but it's more than possible. It's just kind of inviting these wider discussions. I don't know if that makes any sense. But Sam, that's my sort of short answer. Why isn't it happening?
Why isn't it happening? But I think so, taking it back to what you had talked about, essentially plantation economy from the birth of the slave trade, right? So that was a very specific, conscious decision that was taken by a very specific group of influential people. So these are the sites of cultural evolution that we're talking about. These are in systems thinking, it's a leverage point, but I want to specifically bring in the point about the passing of time and the evolution of a specific type of culture that always starts by the selection of a very particular niche, which is always very influential people making a very small specific set of decisions. So that's what takes me now to the scale of where we're at and the role of inner work. So the idea is that there is a class of influential people that exist in the world today. And we know them because they constantly say, I'm not influential. Right? But yet they hold the keys to those sorts of decisions. And they're all over the place in the kind of sector description that Garry had provided us with regards to the people who are in place who may have, let's say, the job role that they don't actually have influence in. You know, so for example, the I don't know, corporate sustainability person in a particular massive firm doesn't actually have say in how sort of like operational decisions for sustainability are, right? They just sort of have the observational role of that. So the leverage and the influence within sectors look very different from the actual explicit function of the person, right? And that's what I'm getting at when I'm talking about influence, because when you look at the slave trade, again, it was never, you know, no politician stood up and said, like, we should do slave trade. Like, you know, that's not how it started, right? At least I hope not. How it started was people found out that this is a way that they can make money, right? So that was a very conscious decision to say, I want to experiment with this way of making money. And then I want to spread it around with like my friends who are also influential. So the point I'm getting to is that in order for something to blossom to this sort of scale, we just need to focus on this very specific element of cultural evolution that is taking place all the time now today, right? And the role of inner work of these people who are taking these decisions, these very influential people who may not see themselves as influential and may not actually be identified as influential. It's sort of like hidden in the ether, but yet we know how to identify them because these are the people taking those decisions. And we have ways to trace back to a very specific sort of, let's say, a type of contract that is suddenly written as a new thing, right? Between a certain type of person with a certain type of power and another type of person with a totally different type of power. So the aspect of inner work and this, you know, this regenerative leadership concept of how leadership is actually needed, actually for me speaks to the consciousness, going back to Garry's point, of those people taking those decisions in a very specific, intentional way. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about that, Garry, because that probably is very close to what maybe you're hoping.
Yeah, it's really close, because it's just so interesting listening to you both, because I want to start with like the innocence of how we are where we are today. Like, I genuinely don't believe anybody, as you said, went out and said, hey, in 100 years, there's going to be like 8 oligarchs that own 70% of the world's money. Like, that was not designed. There is no way that was a design. If it was, they'd bottle it and they'd be selling it on eBay. So like, there's no way that was designed. It was just so it is close to my heart, because what I'm seeing and sensing, being someone within industry, Sam, is the more I reach out and talk to other human beings, the clearer I get that it is actually not that difficult to send the system towards more regenerative ways. Like, it will take a financial leverage point, it will take a business leverage point for sure, but I think like you said, I think it's a handful of, it's identifying those leverage points, right? If I give you an example, so in the UK, the 6 richest people, monetary wise, in the UK, have the same accumulated wealth as the bottom 13.2 billion. So it's a 1/6 basically of the UK population have the same accumulated wealth as the 6 richest people in the UK. Like, we understand how that comes to being, how the leverage of the financial system, private equity then then funds chemical companies buying other chemical companies. So there's this whole cancerous element to the system that nobody's calling out within business, inverted commas. So you've got like your David Suzuki and Tyson and all these other great sort of thinkers bringing that to the fore now. But I can show you, Sam and Lorraine, that is not a conversation that's happening in the boardroom within the chemical industry. And that's the point I want to make, is that's no judgment of anyone that works in chemicals. I want to come back to Lorraine's point about the opportunity and the reimagining and the possibility. And what I'm working on is how can we bring these CEOs and these key influencers, as you say, wherever they sit in the organization, into the same space to have a safe, generative conversation about where we are and where we want to go. So it is close because I know there's the will and the passion, the desire for this to come to the fore. But I think there's a lack of belief that, or it just feels really, really big, because it is big. And I think it's going to take the likes of Lorraine and you, Sam, and a number of us to shine the light on a range of different ways to step into this conversation. And I think there's a lot of CEOs in the chemical industry that would actually like to be part of this conversation, but the ego's in the way. They've got their peers that are still taking 20 million a year in a bonus and they want to make 21 because that's what their club's all about. Like, so that there is that inner work piece. And I'm speaking from experience because I've done it myself and I continue to be doing it. I could not be in this conversation a year ago. You know that, Sam. Even 12 months ago, I would not. I don't know why I'm here now. You two are way too clever for me. But in the nice. But you know what I mean. Like, genuinely, like I would not be able to feel this conversation. That's the point I want to make. I could speak intellectually from here about it, but I wouldn't be able to speak from a heart connected, okay, like joined up way through my body as well as out of my mouth. And I think that's the work that so few of us are doing within big industry, because we're too busy. Next quarter's results, we've got pressure from the venture capitalists. And I think the financial market, for me, I want to show up and hear from you two. The financial market is the part that needs the most work. And it's the part that's getting away scot-free without being tackled. Because that's the beating heart of the current systems. Like everything is fed out the funding mechanism, whichever direction you want to look at. And until we go after that and have proper grown-up generative conversations in finance, I don't think much else will nudge very quickly. So I'll go quiet. I'm interested in your challenges.
Oh, the financial beating heart. That's where my arrow is pointed. I feel like there's a couple layers of challenge there. They're like nested Russian dolls of complexity. And there's an easy-ish one to think about that I think we three and others can collectively do something about in the near term. In fact, I think people are doing things about it, which is, so I mentioned green bonds and, we're celebrating the issuance of more green bonds. Let me home in on that for a moment, because I think that's one of those stats I see going around as like, yeah, we hear you, this inequality, this aggregation of wealth here when it should be distributed here, and we need to think about our ecology within commerce. So yeah, we got it. And so look at all these trillions flowing into green bonds. This is an indicator of progress, right? And I would say wrong, unfortunately. And I say this with a lot of respect for like friends who've helped create green bonds and friends who are part of the green bonds principles, like crafting them, and others who are, in major global banks supporting the underwriting of these bonds. So I'm sort of, I guess, at least friends with the problem, if not part of the problem. Why do I think it's a problem? Because when you look at the green bonds principles, when you look at what constitutes a climate aligned bond, and how the proceeds of the bond need to be distributed in order to qualify, it's not necessarily bad things. It's not that you look at that and go, oh no, that's the worst thing ever to do with money, but it's definitely not regenerative. It's usually something along the lines of creating more renewable energy. So yeah, I'm not anti-renewable energy, but it's not necessarily regenerative if we're just like pumping more power into the grid. And the way the renewable energy is generated may not be like, sometimes hydroelectric classifies as, well, it classifies as renewable, and sometimes green bonds are used for hydroelectric. And you cast your eye around the world and see what's going on with dam construction. If you are a fish, your heart stops beating. Like, that is not regenerative. It is disastrous. And so there's a lot of green, no, there's some green bonds that are, the proceeds are doing things that I'd say they're generally good. They're increasing affordable housing. They're retrofitting real estate so that it is more eco-efficient. Definitely some good things are going on, but it is far from regenerative. So to say, look at the trillions of dollars going into that, see, we're solving the problem, I would say, no, we're not even recognizing the problem. And by the way, that's the easy Russian doll. That's the one we can do something about, where we can say, oh, well, let's reorient how we classify green bonds, which is happening all the time. It's an iterative process. The principles have shifted over the years. They will keep shifting. People can and will and are going to influence shifting those principles so that they recognize regeneration, and we'll get there. But then I think we have an even bigger challenge, and this one makes me feel a bit uneasy to say on the record, but I'll say it anyway, which is, well, when you take that further and you say, what does it look like to finance regeneration? Well, regeneration doesn't live in a world of scarcity. Regeneration is not about, I've got a bunch and you don't, so I'm wealthier than you. Regeneration lives in a world of connection and collaboration and abundance. Its scarcity is its antithesis. So when you finance regeneration, you finance abundance. And suddenly the concepts of things like return on investment, compound interest, all the things that we've based our monetary system on, which also include scarcity and a debt-based kind of fractional reserve mentality that is how our monetary system works, they go away because they no longer make sense in a regenerative world. And so we have this paradox where I believe we are literally talking about financing the end of finance as it exists today, which is a very awkward proposition and a difficult sell, I would say. So yet I think that is what needs to happen, because it's absurd that 6 people in the UK have more than the rest of, you know, the layer of society who's, by the way, doing all the work and creating all the value.
For sure. And so there was so much I wanted to kind of bring in, and it's sort of, on the one hand, it's questions to ask, but also I have my own sort of opinions on what those answers are, which is, and I'm going to bring the answer first, which is the answer to the paradox for me is collapse. There's no way we are transitioning. There's no such thing. We're going to be pushed to the point, to breaking point where everything breaks, and then we're going to start again. That's how civilizations have always restarted, and this is how it's going to be for us, albeit on a global scale this time, with many, many, many generations of pain that will wash out from this whole thing. But the question is around studies like, you know, various ways of studying social change, be it from a cultural perspective, be it from an economic perspective, be it from a political perspective, etc. Like, all of these intertwining stories of how social change happens essentially speaks to the power of the mob. And there's a lot of, especially in spirituality and various types of, especially Asian spirituality, there's this understanding of a sort of kind of collective consciousness or a collective will of what it is that people want. And what is manifesting is precisely what the collective will wants. So my answer to that, or my issue with that, and which is why the paradox is collapse, is we have perfected propaganda through a very well-practiced system of colonialism that has essentially created something called like state media and like a mass media machine that is just insistent on corroding minds, not to mention the infiltration of this corruption into education systems all around the world, etc. So the base of that collective will that we talked about in especially Asian spirituality is no longer founded upon like anything that is actually real to humanity. So the power of the mob then becomes question mark, question mark, question mark. Therefore, my answer to the paradox can only be collapse. We've cut ourselves so, like, you know, we're in too deep. There's only one way to go, in my view. Garry.
Well, to be honest, I don't want to stay too much on the financial trip, but I think it's, I have to agree from a point of view that, think about for a second, you want to talk about degenerative? What would happen if every single human being called their money, as we know money today, out of the bank right now? It's not there. It's fresh air. And I don't think we're, so I think if we think about that from a scarcity point of view, literally the fabric of society in 2020 is a complete mirage. So from that point of view, if the beating heart of the current system is finance and finance is made up, I would have to agree that collapse is the only way to regenerate, is to let the old die and turn to compost into the new. It's a terrifying prospect on the one hand, because it's just so new, and just for so many of us to even talk like that. For me to talk like that is just like, what? Can I be pro-collapse? Really? But when you sense into it from a humanitarian and ecological and do we still want to be here in 50 years time point of view, then it's just, I think it becomes a necessary step of the process. So yeah, and then I think about the chemicals industry within which I'm part of today. You know, that, and I think about like how connected all of that is, Sam. Yeah, and you know, we've all spoken about that it goes into everything, because we've been brought up on that over 100 years, that everything has to have that in, because that group of people you spoke about over 100 years have said the world needs this. So I think, yeah, so I do think that is a necessary evil. I do think it's a necessary evil. What do you think, Lorraine?
Yeah, well, a couple things. I guess I think I follow the trail with collapse being inevitable, and I can still interpret collapse as a kind of transition. So it still means people will do things, and people will do things differently. And what are those things? And decisions will be made. So when I think about the companies and the industries that I connect with and the dreams I have on their behalf to transition to regeneration, I'm holding the collapse awareness and thinking, well, as one Brazilian friend of mine put it, and I'll translate it into English, you know, the future may look pretty bad, but we still have a lot of present to work with. And it's like, well, we're here now. Why not make the best possible decisions now, which may be preparing for this incredible upheaval that's coming. And it prepares us better. So you could think of it as prepping, sort of industrial preppers, you know, and what does that look like? Because the change is coming. So people, when they read Jem Bendel's Deep Adaptation article a couple of years ago, and I remember reading it and sort of passing it around, and the number one response I got back from people was like, oh my God, I'm so depressed. And I was actually surprised by that. I was like, doesn't it feel empowering to call out what you've been sensing all along? Like this is happening. And then to be empowered to say, okay, so here we are now. What decisions can I take now? How can I treat myself and others now so that through this process, we're loving and caring and enabled? That to me seems a much more friendly way to go through collapse than, mass suicide or terror or terrorizing. And I guess I just want to touch on the state media thing, because I totally agree that we have created incredibly effective propaganda machines. You're validating, Sam, I don't even know how I came to it, but a number of years ago, I just sort of stopped taking in mainstream media. A little bit seeps in, but for the most part, none, which it sometimes leads to embarrassment, but I'm actually quite happy with it. And I just want to remind us that with the financial universe that we live in for the most part now, and the media machine that wraps around it and us, a lot of it is fiction. And we get to decide which fictions we accept. So for example, we called today at the top of this call, we called it Tuesday. We've just agreed there are 7 days in the week, and we've got some time zones and we're all in different ones. And there are certain realities there, like the sun is so far up here and so far up there and not up at all there. Fine, that's not fiction, but that it's Tuesday, we've just agreed on that. And we've agreed that it's 2021, but actually, you know what, in Ethiopia, it's not 2021. They have a different calendar. It's a different year in Ethiopia. And we've agreed that we work Monday to Friday, but we don't work Saturday and Sunday unless you do shift work, or you're working overtime, or you're freelance or whatever. We made these fictions up and we've agreed to them. We get to decide what fictions we want to keep and which ones we want to give to the myth department and let it go into the past and move into new ones. And I'm just talking about time and days of the week, but there's all kinds of things like being rich is desirable, or even what being rich is. And so we described those 6 richest people in the UK, and we know that means they have the most money in their bank accounts. Who are the 6 richest people in the UK really? What makes them rich? Well, maybe, Garry, you're one of them, right? Like, you seem pretty rich to me, given the conversations we're having. So I think we're at a place, the collapse isn't necessarily food availability, although I think that's going to be part of it. It isn't necessarily infrastructure functioning or not. I think that's going to be part of it. I think the collapse is in the fictions. They're coming down, a bunch of them are crashing, and then we get to decide, what do we replace them with?
And the fictions will collapse when all of the materiality around those fictions collapse. That's the only way we get the mirror held up against whatever, right? So the collapse of the global story, including the global economy, everything, in transitioning, and yes, I agree that term can be anything. Transition is any sort of change into localization.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. What will replace in that void when the fiction is collapsed in the global south? That would be very easily replaced, because we still have the old stories. They're just under the surface. They're very much there, and it will take a certain level of desperation for them to revive, but we will get there, right? In the global north, that's where the problem lies, because we're already seeing, right, this massive, again, stealing of all the stories. Let's look at like Buddha and his teachings, and it's like, okay, like you guys have your own teachings because you guys have your own like bioregions, okay? There's a whole other ecology for which your mythologies are actually relevant, and that's what you need to go back to. And so one is this kind of pendulum swaying back and forth of whose fictions are being imposed upon whom or being stolen from whom. And then secondly, it's the thing that you point out that Jem Bendel himself explains in his paper about why people reject his paper, which is the psychological impossibility of being able to consider and plan for your own death. It's just not possible, apparently, according to him, in terms of the psyche of how we can imagine a world that is collapsing. And yet we're here in it. We're here in it. This year, 2021, the World Food Programme has called the Year of Famine. And not to mention like all the stuff, I feel like there just has to be a brief mention of everything that's happening in the United States of America right now, just because it's such a shit show. I feel like that's worth special mention because it didn't take that long, just a few short years to get to this point. Although obviously the symptoms, the undercurrents have been bubbling for, I don't know, 50, 75 years. And now we're starting to see it in all of these, let's say, industrialized / developed nations, otherwise known as the global north, whereas they have always been happening in the global south and are being exacerbated, not just by the obviously COVID, but also by accelerated climate change, which it's right now busting all projections. All the extreme projections are being just blown through easy. No worries at all. So in terms of how collapse will happen, especially in my lifetime, this is, I mean, I honestly, two things. I don't know why people are not rioting. I don't understand. And secondly, I don't see why people are still having children. I really don't. Because that is the only conscious way, in my opinion, to manage the transition. Let's stop new human beings coming into the system until we can figure out a way that we can actually carry them through with some responsibility and empathy into a new world that we actually want them to go off and create on their own, to enable them to be able to do the best that they can. And we're not, like in the next 10 years, we're not in a space to be able to do that. That's my personal kind of opinion and seeing the patterns of where it's going. And also obviously knowing people who just in the last few months have had babies and very pretty babies at that. I'm still saying that, you know. Garry.
I just want to say thank you, Lorraine, for your description actually of collapse, because I think the collapse of the human ego is actually probably one of the biggest elements of collapse that I'm sensing into, actually, which speaks a bit to what Lorraine's talking about. And it's actually what I am also feeling into with this outreach project that I'm working on at the moment about trying to find ways to bring together these different people from different sections of society and of industry into a holistic conversation. Because that in and of itself takes dissolving of the ego to say, this isn't just about me, it's about a collective. So I just really wanted to sort of speak to that, Lorraine, actually, that collapse element. So I think there is a very real risk of financial collapse. And I'm not going to like stay away from that. I think there is a very, very real risk of the financial system like seriously collapsing. But at the same time, what could grow? You know, what could the new seeds be if it did? So I think about things like universal basic income. Like whatever anybody's view of it is, why would we not have a society where everybody has guaranteed food, water, and shelter over their head, and then done the work that they really cared about and not had to do 4 jobs just to put a roof over their head? And in the UK, for example, we've had emergency UBI since the pandemic started. Everyone's been getting guaranteed money. It's the same in different parts of the world. So I guess I'm seeing this conversation through the lens of 2 things. One, I've got my traditional corporate sort of business lens where I can see the collapse of the human ego being a huge benefit to not only those individuals, but to the capitalist system. And then I see the financial collapse of being a very real one. And I think actually that needs to happen. That old paradigm needs to die so that it seeds a new collective humane way of supporting life on the planet. And because by doing that, then we keep that flared ego at bay. If we start to come at things from a collective, okay, let's now look at the local. And I agree with that, Sam, as well. Like the conversation I have with my own wife about let's try and do more stuff in the garden. Like all my friends are talking about it. Like this is not a mythological, no, it's not a myth of a conversation. Like everybody's suddenly gone, wow, God, we are situated in place. We're not flying around the world anymore. And why were we doing that when we've got so much more we can be doing locally? So there's lots of levels and layers, like back to your nested point, like there's a lot of nested thought processes, I think, that all of us individually and collectively are working through at the moment. And I think the sooner we can drop the human ego and the financial system, those two things collapsing, I think the rebirth will be actually quite significant very, very quickly, actually. But that's my hypothesis for the afternoon.
I love it. You're reminding me, Garry, there's a wonderful book that came out, I think just last year, by Judith Schwartz called The Reindeer Chronicles. It's a series of essays of place-based regeneration. And these are stories where you hear how it was at the beginning and you just think, yeesh, and then what the communities or bioregions were able to do. And it's global, there's different places around the world. And it often with very little money, like you just look at the size of the budget and it's like not even close to one of the corporate bonuses we were talking about off the top of the call. And so like we're more than capable of doing really amazing things in place where we are, either within our own little postage stamp garden or in a wider region. But you're reminding me of two things I'll maybe say in sum. One about famine, Sam, that the World Food Program is calling this the Year of Famine. I'm going to say something probably unpopular in the land of breaking down fictions, but it's my understanding that in almost any historical instance where the word famine has been used, it's actually been starvation due to policy and war. And so I'm very uncomfortable with the word famine. I'll use Ethiopia as an example because it's a country I have some context and experience in. But when I was a youth, the famine in Ethiopia was a big deal and the rock stars were singing about it and raising money. And it wasn't until I grew up and decided to ask some questions and read and talk to people outside of the mainstream media and like Bono and U2 that I learned that a lot of the fundraising paid for armaments and funded the soldiers. And there was plenty of food being grown, but farmers couldn't take it to the market because they were being bombed when they got there. So they sometimes couldn't even harvest because they had to hide. And a lot of the deaths were related to policy, so much so there's an incredible book. It's very heartrending. It's practically like a diary published by Human Rights Watch called something like Evil Days. Have to double check, that chronicles the weather patterns in Ethiopia in the lead up to the famine. And we understood it to be a drought, that the rains didn't come. There won't be rain in Africa this Christmas, the song that gets played in all the horrible malls. But the deaths by starvation predated the drought. It was not because the rains didn't fall. It was because of policy and conflict that people and food didn't get together as much as they needed to. So I look at this call by the World Food Program of famine, and to me that signals like, what are we going to do? People are going to starve. People are going to keep getting fat here. That's what's going to happen. We're going to overeat calories here because we're so disconnected from how things work. The World Food Policy should be calling like a fat problem here. And then notice that's also policy and a different kind of conflict, inner disconnection and lack of awareness of how we relate to the soil, to the food, to the land, to the farmers. And then call bullshit on the word famine and say like, wait a minute, what's really happening here? And often if it is drought related, it's because we fucked the land up. And then read Judith Schwartz, Reindeer Chronicles, and look at incredible examples from around the world where we already know how to do this. And it's happening in lots of other places, and go, do that. Like, don't throw our hands up. So that's
Just want to add that officially the World Food Program are calling it a famine due to COVID, not due to climate change. That's the official line. COVID has fucked up logistics chains, the entire food distribution system, right. And there's not enough food, essentially, for like 2021 is what they're saying.
Right.
But yeah, please continue.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I won't comment on COVID because I know we're going to hit the top of the hour, but I will say even that the word famine feels like a fiction being forced through the media without providing means to address it, which we have. And so I guess the last thing I want to say, circling back to the financial piece, which would solve for the famine, is that I do think the financial system is collapsing. It cannot possibly continue. The math just doesn't work. Like the exponential nature of the financialization of the markets is too problematic. And by the way, they know it, right? Like if you look at the materiality assessments in the ESG reports of companies, of large banks, one of the biggest issues they identify is system risk. Or systemic risk. That's kind of euphemistic way of saying collapse. However, in the transition, I believe this is where we come in, and others and many within these banking communities, is to look at what can they seed and grow as that takes place. And so how can they push the resources they have into more real assets and humans and people and minds and hearts, so that whatever happens on the other side, people are empowered to look after each other with real things, not imaginary paper fiction money or this idea of being rich. So I see the collapse as financing the end of finance. It's kind of my dream, although it's a bit bumpy.
Okay, so rounding out, we are at the top of the hour, and I just wanted a final quick round on what is the sector shifting work? If you were doing sector shifting work, what would that look like?
Oh, we're both being so polite, Lorraine. I don't want to oversimplify it, Sam, but it is consciousness, awareness raising. Like, and what I mean by that is what Lorraine's doing, what you're helping me with, Sam, which is this: we have to understand and sense into wider systems and the nested systems. And what I mean by that, and it's linked back to the food conversation you've both been having, I can throw something into that mix, which is, over the last 8 weeks, the Shanghai price for sea containers has gone up 6x in the last 6 weeks, because China started the pandemic and they're the first one to open. So their demand for containers to ship their stuff to the rest of the world has gone through the roof. They can't get them back into China quick enough. So the price of their product, with their sea containers, has gone up 6x in 6 weeks. So the point is, we can talk about like a famine through COVID, or we can talk about the chemical industry, or we can talk about Regenerative. But until we come together, people with different backgrounds, different knowledge, different understanding, different sectors, different roles, and have this sort of conversation more often with a really clear what next. Yeah, and I think there's more questions for me about what that what next is, but just having this conversation has given me 5 or 6 other ideas about who I could approach, or how I might want to show up, or the conversation I want to be having. So I think it's a combination of, there needs to be a systemic intention around how do we connect together as human beings, cross-party, cross-sector, cross-industry. Yeah. Plus, how do we realize that we don't want to be, we want to, I would invite us, all of us that have taken the time to listen to us today, just to check in with those myths and those fables, the stories we may be telling ourselves that are actually stopping us being part of this activation. Because there's so many people I know that want to be, but there's a story telling them that it shouldn't be them, or maybe they're not good enough, or why them. So I think they're my 2 invitations really, is yeah, do your best to get out of your own way, whilst believing that you are part of the solution, because you are.
I love that, Garry. That's so good. I want to do those things. And I guess my call to action, I would say, for anybody in a corporate or planning or strategic role, I think you've got 3 steps. One is to end the planning and implementation of things that cause harm. If you're in an energy company, stop building dams. If you're in a food company, stop designing cheaper foods that don't contribute to gut health, mental health, soil health. Like, just stop strategically planning in to the medium and longer term the things that are causing us harm. You have the power to do that for sure. And then start dreaming, imagining this awareness thing, Garry, that you just talked about. What does it look and feel like when you are in an interconnected, dynamic, healthy, thriving, living system? You know, and what role could you, should you, or your company or your product or your service or your ideas play in that? And like, let your mind go into the most beautiful places, because our mind is endlessly regenerative. I mean, the power is limitless. So go there, and go there with your colleagues and your friends and your family or your pets, your plants, and let that idea flourish, and have no idea what it is and go there anyway. And then I'd say that's a second and really important thing, because that's what you get to substitute the things you stop doing with the things you start doing. And eventually they have the power to come together. Maybe not all with you, but you ignite or unleash those things. And thirdly, I would describe a need to cope with the transition. And that's about being kind to yourself, to ourselves, to each other. That's about being compassionate. There's already a lot of suffering, and there's potentially more down the road. And so just a sense of coping and fun and elegance and beauty and rest and whatever is needed to manage through challenging times. So it's stop causing harm, start creating wellness, and treat ourselves well in the process. Just that.
Thank you both. For me, I think I'm definitely seeing value in radicalization over incrementalization, or is that the right word? Incrementalism. That's the biggest thing. And that speaks to the, so what I'm going to call entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship within organizations. And this idea of innovation not being a technocratic activity, but rather an intergenerational one. And by that, I mean, let's skip the generations that made all the problems and try to go to what was before, and also what is in the future. So I think all those elements together is what I would like to package up and give to the youth of the world who have not yet been corrupted by this particular form of cultural evolution. And well, there's that, and also like to tell people my age to stop having babies, because that's really fucked up. Yeah. That, in my opinion, is sector shifting work. Not necessarily through any particular sector, but more of how each sector needs to be able to firstly appreciate diverse thinking, to be able to bring in entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship, and secondly to be able to be challenged, which is not what I'm seeing right now. Yeah, and the socioeconomics of a lot of this sector shifting work must not be ignored at all. So just as Lorraine was talking about, how does a fish feel? I think it would probably be the title of this podcast if it was a podcast. And I'm going to end the recording here, unless anyone would like to add any last final words. Sweet.
Thank you.